All right, kind enough to join us like chestnuts roasting on an open fire. Over his right shoulder is our buddy FBI Special Agent Pete Lapp. He's also the author of a fantastic book out there over his right shoulder for people watching on YouTube, The Queen of Cuba, the story of Ana Montes, the former DIA analyst, and how Pete took her down. He's going to tell us all about it. Pete, Mike, and Nick, thank you so much for hopping on the pod, buddy.
Thank you for having me on. Can we please talk? Got to add the please. It's very important.
That's right. As I always say, there's a Jewish women's podcast out there called Can We Talk? And they forgot to be polite, and we added the please. So, Pete, in that vein, let's please talk about your book. I want to get into a bunch with you because since we started recording, I want to say like I saw you a couple months ago at a book signing event down here in Miami, and there was some news that broke around that time of another former U.S. diplomat giving information to the Cuban government. We're going to get into that in just a second, how that ties into your book. But why don't you tell our audience, we had you on before the book was out, you know, a year or so ago. Now the book's out. Everything went through FBI surveillance of your book and what's been redacted. And you'll see sections of the book that's been redacted. But why don't you tell folks the story of Ana Montes, how you got her, what made you want to turn it into a book?
So how we got her, because it was definitely a team effort. 10 days after 9/11, the FBI arrested a woman, which is unique and significant to the story, who was committing espionage against the U.S. intelligence community on behalf of the Cuban intelligence service. She had done that for 17 years almost. She was a couple of days short of 17 years by that point. And it's a significant, interesting story because for a lot of different reasons. Ana went to the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, which is it's the CIA of the Department of Defense, in essence, to spy for the Cubans. She had ambitions of other, working for non-government agencies, Amnesty International, and then she met the Cubans, and fate drove her to wanting to help what the Cubans were trying to do in El Salvador and Nicaragua, in what the time was a very controversial U.S. foreign policy. Think back to Iran-Contra, the scandal. We were supporting the Contras in El Salvador and Nicaragua, who were trying to overthrow the Sandinistas, and it was not a very it had a lot of dissension, to include in academic circles and Ana in particular. So she spied for 17 years, provided a tremendous amount of classified information to Cuba, not for money, for more anti-American beliefs versus ideological beliefs. But I think it's an interesting story, and the fact that she is a woman is incredibly rare. The FBI has not arrested a lot of women over the years who have committed espionage in and of themselves. And I think that's a dynamic part of the story that sometimes gets underappreciated, to be honest with you.
To hear it from the way Anna sort of talks about it, her argument had been that, the U.S. was wrong, allegedly, in, the way they had went about their business, for lack of a better phrase. How do you assess that in light of the fact that people can, working for the United States government, I'm a good example of it. I don't work for the government, obviously, but, as a citizen, there's things I don't necessarily agree with. But how do you reconcile, having a disagreement with the government, but then acting, intentionally to try to attack or corrupt it from within?
It's a great question and a great analogy, because we can have, as government holders, I've retired, so I'm free to have any opinion that I want to a degree. And whether you vote for that individual or not, there will be things that president does that you probably disagree with. Ana, I don't believe, voted for Ronald Reagan. I don't know her politics per se, but my understanding of her was that she didn't vote for Ronald Reagan. But she really had this visceral empathy for, to that point, the United States getting involved in things in her mind they shouldn't be involved in. And there are reasonable debates, policy debates, that we can have on that. Nicaragua and El Salvador, Reagan was thinking, against communism and the spread of communism throughout Central America, and worried about Cuba's influence and the Sandinistas and all that, in terms of trying to keep the United States from another Cuban Missile Crisis, from another, that Cold War mentality was real back then. Reasonable people can disagree about it, but it when you take that further step to take action and have it be a call to action, and then you commit espionage, that's where we disagree. I mean, First Amendment, sure, but then deviating into criminal behavior after that is where obviously the line was crossed. And it's a shame, because Anna, is an incredibly smart person. I have said this a number of times. If she had used her intelligence for good, she would not have wasted 39 years of her life. And in my mind, in my opinion, it was a waste. She could have taken that intelligence, those skills that she still has, and used them to really help people. And that's not what she did with helping Cuba.
Pete, it's so funny that you say that, because in the book you talk about a lot of the similarities you and Anna, had, and how you think in a different world maybe you guys would have been friends because of some of those similarities. But I wanted to ask you because obviously we follow each other across social, we're friends, obviously, and I know on LinkedIn you've been posting about different ways that I guess there's like training that goes into every year about the different examples of like an Ana Montes, or like some of the other examples of folks that have committed espionage or espionage related crimes against the US. So I wanted to kind of ask you, what does our government do to prevent us getting spied on? To Nick's point, like neither of us have worked for the government. I haven't had a clearance. Nick, you got a clearance? I don't think Nick's got a clearance, kind of like Dumb and Dumber. Did you get a gun? I didn't get a gun. So how does the government prevent us getting spied on?
It's hard. It's really hard. You look at 330 million people in this country. There's about 4 million clearance holders that include government and contractors. It's hard to vet 4 million people, and the background investigation that each and every clearance holder goes through is never meant to. It's just not deep enough to catch spies. That's not the goal of a background investigation. When the FBI went to talk to my neighbors, when they went to talk to my universities, they were evaluating my trustworthiness and credibility to have a position of trust and access to classified information. Not necessarily was I a spy. It's just not an in-depth background investigation. It's very difficult. One of the things we do is we train, we talk, we do awareness. Anna, it's interesting about Anna because she doesn't understand her notoriety. So she says. I think there's a little bit of bullshit there, to be honest with you. But she claims that she doesn't really know why people focus on her. Prior to 2001, when she was arrested, every year she had to get trained from the government on insider threats, and she would hear the Aldrich Ames story. She would hear the John Walker story. She would hear these high-profile espionage cases that had been prosecuted, that were known in the public domain, if you will, and basically, don't be a John Walker, don't be an Aldrich Ames. Well, now it's don't be an Ana Montes. And that's been part of my motivation in writing the book, is I knew there was a hero worshiper, coming after she was released. She has a tremendous amount of fans and admirers and people that look at her as a celebrity. And I wanted to try and do the best I could to shed some reality in that, and argue that, what she did was wrong. Whether she believed in our policy or not, she crossed a very dangerous line, and people's lives were absolutely affected by it. First and foremost, her brother, her sister, her and her other brother, and her mother. The people that love her the most, she affected their lives, very significantly.
As you were just talking about training, something that occurred to me is when you spend all those years, in an agency, and you've got to be trained to constantly, essentially, what feels like to be on the job on a regular basis. Like, this is something that your mind has to be sort of zeroed in on. In civilian life, now that now that you've retired, what elements of that training sort of always come from within you? What benefits you, and where are there times where you wish you could just sort of be able to turn it off and sort of be able to step into a place where you're you're not necessarily trained to sort of, think in a certain way and sort of be more, within the scene and more chilled out, I guess, for lack of a better phrase.
Yeah, and I think when we think people that go to work at the FBI, at DIA, at NSA, wherever they go in the intelligence community, the job is hard enough to begin with. You're an investigator, you're an analyst, you're collecting, you're analyzing, whatever it is that you do. That in and of itself is difficult because, especially in counterintelligence, I mean, everything is mirrors. There's shades of gray that I wrote in the book Sherman Williams hasn't even invented yet. And that part of the job is hard enough. And then you're kind of looking over, to the degree that how much do you not trust your coworkers? I had a cheesy envelope from Robert Hansen, and I didn't know Robert Hansen, but I talked to him on the phone at least once or twice, obviously before he was arrested. Did I suspect? I didn't have an interaction with Hansen long enough to suspect that he may have, but it's a typical interaction that someone will have with another person. And then you get to this point where you don't want to be paranoid that everyone in your circle and everyone in the FBI or whatever has potentially a spy. We can't operate if we think there's a spy behind every tree. So you've got to act from a default position of trust. And unfortunately, when you do that, kind of back to your original question, you're going to miss things. If we're constantly surveilling all of our employees, and creating this atmosphere of mistrust, you're gonna have a hard time recruiting and retaining people that are going to come work for, fill in the blank 3-letter agency. It's not going to be a good environment to work in. So where's that balance? Where's that balance between scrutiny and awareness and paranoia? And that's something that I think the government struggles with to this day.
Pete, I was reading the Washington Post article the other day. And by the way, when Latinos say the other day, we mean like 4 months ago. And I'm reading this about U.S. diplomat Manuel Roca, that he was arrested. He turned out to be a Cuban spy. And I was like, instantly thought of, obviously, the Queen of Cuba and your book. And then I'm further down scrolling in the article. Pete Lapp is quoted in the article talking about this. And I'm like, hey, that's utilizing subject matter expertise. So is it, I guess there's like a two-parter in here, but like first, explain a little bit of the Roca case to folks and how this guy, U.S. diplomat, obviously totally different, not working for one of the 3-letter agencies, but he's over here sharing information with the Cuban government. You've mentioned this in public places about how the Cuban intelligence agency is really, really strong, and that one to be taken serious, right? And I don't think people understand that. And then also on the other side, on the flip side of this, is really about the larger, which is multiple countries are invested in getting knowledge about the U.S. And we're seeing these things come to light. There may be other Rocas, like you just said, 4 million people. It's tough to scrutinize and give clearances to all these folks. So take us a little bit inside, not only the case with Roca, but also the larger question about people wanting to learn more about the U.S. and its operations.
So Roca is a fascinating case, just the length of time that he seemed to have been employed by the Cuban intelligence service. I doubt he received any money. He likely was like Anna, where he believed in the cause. Kind of back to your point about being Hispanic. Do we focus just on Cuba's very good at recruiting, and they're incredibly accomplished in that. And if we just focused on Hispanics working in the government who may be aligned ideologically or from a mindset with Cuba, we would have missed Kendall Myers, who spied at the State Department for Cuba for a number of years. And he's a descendant of Alexander Graham Bell. He's as blue-blooded as you can get. We do have to think about, Roca from the perspective of what was he able to affect from a policy perspective. He was not a guy who, from my understanding, had a lot of, in the totality of his career, had a lot of day-to-day access to classified information. There were segments of his career when he had really good access. Roca was probably an individual who had an ability to influence policy far greater than Anna did. And I think that's going to be, depending on whether there's a damage assessment that is publicized once this case is all said and done, whether there's a conviction via trial or a plea, that's going to be the key question I have, is how much policy was he able to influence given his perch. I'm aware that he was able to really had some significant access at the White House, and therefore Anna couldn't really move policy in a different direction. She might be able to quash the publication of an intelligence paper here and there. Certainly had access day in and day out to very sensitive classified information over the totality of her 17-year career. But Rocha could be almost, if not more, damaging, because I have a feeling, as an outsider looking in, that he had policy influence capability, and that's going to be really interesting to watch as this case unfolds. I mean, you've got the Attorney General, all but coming out and saying he was a Cuban spy, but basically we don't have enough evidence to prove espionage, which is, as I know, from my own experience, very difficult to prove. And it's not just knowing. Big difference between we knew he passed classified information. You have to know with specificity and to prove that. And that seems to be what is lacking right now with the FBI and the Department of Justice, of no criticism of them, because it happened so long ago. You're looking at a historical case, very difficult to prove, at least 10 years after he had access to classified information, if not longer.
You were talking earlier about distrust. It's hard to ignore some of the recent candidates, particularly for the GOP. One that comes to mind is Vivek Ramaswamy, who's now suspended his campaign. Pete, as someone who has worked for the United States government, who's worked for the FBI, when you're hearing candidates talk about deep state and trying to sow mistrust within established agencies of law enforcement, or essentially just, working at the arm of the federal government, in totality, what does that do to the perception of the agencies? But then more practically speaking, for colleagues of yours who are currently employed by the FBI or other agencies, what does it do for their morale?
It's hard. And it's funny. I was out in Dallas, Texas. I went to the the Dallas Cowboy and the Washington Commanders game only because my significant other wanted to see Dolly Parton, who put on a phenomenal halftime show. It coincided with the 60th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination. And I had been to Dealey Plaza before on a previous trip, but my brother said, hey, by the way, tomorrow's the 60th anniversary. And I was like, wow, we have to go. So we went to Dealey Plaza on the 60th anniversary. And it was almost like a MAGA rally, to be honest with you, because there was hundreds of people there. And it was very much this deep state conspiracy driven theory. And it all really starts with the Kennedy assassination, which is kind of fascinating. It's disheartening because I was in the FBI, and I'm here to tell you there is no deep state. It just does not exist, and especially in the way that I think a lot of people believe it does. It's kind of funny when you think about it objectively. It's a little funny that they give the FBI, the CIA, the U.S. government that much credit. I mean, it's a tremendous amount of credit that I don't know is properly deserved, because I don't know that it could accomplish some of these things that they've alleged it to have accomplished and keep it a secret. Key factor, you mean to tell me that X, Y, and Z have happened and nobody's talking? Nobody's running to the New York Times. Nobody's running to Congress. That's impressive. And I just think but from a morale perspective, it is disheartening, because your heart of hearts that you're just going to do a job. Of course, you have a worldview, whatever that is. And of course, as a private citizen, even as an FBI agent, you go into the voting booth and you cast your vote one way or another. But then you leave, you watch the results. Maybe you have a couple glasses of wine, you go thumbs up or thumbs down, you go back to work the next day and you do your job. And it doesn't affect you in any way, shape, or form. I mean, your job is to put bad guys and bad women in jail, if that's the case. And that's what I think is disheartening, thinking about my former colleagues that have to do these hard cases, these hard current event cases. They've got families. They're just trying to make ends meet and live lives and raise kids and do the job they've been hired to do as professionally as they can. And that's hard. It was hard to take back then. And it's become even a little bit harder for me now that I'm private citizen, and don't have to do that and put up with that to a degree, but it's knowing that there's still people trying to do that and don't have this First Amendment right that I have. I can talk publicly to a degree about all that, and I'm usually careful. I'm very careful about what I talk about, but it's disheartening.
Well, counter to that, Pete, and by the way, just staying on that for a second, I if you want to talk about bureaucracy and compartmentalization, that happens at every company, right? I didn't know what the CEO of my former company was thinking. It gets trickled down slowly but surely. But on the flip side of that, candidates that are still running, they've been asked a lot about the U.S. right now and the involvement in these foreign wars and who's the next superpower that we could potentially go to war with. Everybody's talking about China's aggression with Taiwan, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We see what's happening in Israel. There was a poll that came out recently, Pete, and I want to tie it into kind of the book, because it was a poll about like, who do you trust to like keep us safe or on foreign policy matters? And, Nikki Haley kind of scored higher on that because of her, ambassadorship when she was at the UN. And it got me thinking, because Anna's an example of kind of why foreign policy matters, right? She's internally giving information back. We have bad actors that are here and we're trying to root those out, but it's because of a government, a foreign actor that's trying to, get us and stuff like that. I would love for you to kind of expand, because now this is a flip side, right? That was a question more about getting rid of the 3-letter agencies. We explained why they matter, but now why their work overseas matters, Pete. Like, can you explain to our audience why foreign policy matters? It always tends to be lower on the list for voters, and we're in a critical election cycle now. You're an example of why it does matter and why we need to keep not only the homeland safe, but what we do abroad is really important.
It is. I mean, the purpose of intelligence, collecting foreign intelligence, is to advise decision makers so that they have the best information in order to make those very hard decisions. Do we go to war here? Do we not go to war? What's the extent of doing this and that and the other thing? It relies on foreign intelligence and the collection of that and that analysis of that. And we've seen historically where the intelligence community hasn't always got it right. Pearl Harbor, 9/11, the Iraq War with WMD, all these events where, good people tried to do the right thing, and the end answer was the opposite of what was originally thought. And I think we've seen those types of examples, but that's really what the goal of those people trying to do overseas, collect vital information that helps keep our country safe. And this is where it kind of gets in that argument where, well, what's wrong with Anna doing what she did? That's what we do to other countries. I had that question at the Spy Museum. Would I be a spy for somebody else if asked? Like, would I volunteer? And I think the question was more, because some of the sources that we had that helped start the investigation, who were over in Cuba, working in the Cuban intelligence service, who decided to help out. Some of them were actually at the book event in Miami that you and I were at. Would I do that? And why wouldn't I? Because isn't that what this game is? I mean, first off, it's not a game. People's lives are at stake, whether they're Americans or folks that are cooperating in foreign countries, risking their lives, committing espionage against their own government that they're currently in. And then number two, I mean, that information that comes back is to the betterment of the United States. And I think at the end of the day, we've got to see ourselves as, that beacon of freedom and the lead of democracy for the world, and trying to do good things throughout the world as best we can. And I think that's where reasonable people may seem to disagree, or even some unreasonable people from time to time.
Pete, before we let you go, we always ask this to authors. I've come up with this new question now. Somebody's at a bookstore. You and I were at the bookstore down here in Coral Gables, and you tap somebody on the shoulder. I don't know if you did this, by the way. You should have. You tap them on the shoulder. They grab your book, right? You tap them on the shoulder, go, "Hey, I wrote that book. This is why you should buy it." Tell those people right now why they should go buy The Queen of Cuba.
It's funny because I went to the Spy Museum this weekend as a tourist, and I did go to the bookstore, and there's one copy left. There used to be like 10 or 12, and now there's one. I didn't do that. I didn't say you should do this. I didn't want to be that guy. You know what I mean?
Right.
I think you should buy Queen of Cuba and read it because I think it offers. I tried to withhold my own judgment. I think that I wrote this. Kelly Kennedy and I wrote this in a way. My co-writer, this dual narrative where we wrote about Anna, then we wrote about me. We went back and forth for a little while because I wanted people to see what your typical FBI agent or FBI employee looks like, what they're going through, what it took to get them to the FBI. And I wanted them to see we made mistakes in the investigation. And I shared those mistakes because I wanted to be authentic. And I wanted people to say, look, the FBI is not perfect. It makes mistakes, but at the end of the day, there's a mugshot that shows what we were able to accomplish. And that is a message I tried to convey to the general reader. And I think the last thing was how hard it is to catch these individuals. It is incredibly difficult. Luck is not a strategy, but oftentimes we get more lucky than we are good. And that's not a criticism, but we get the right person that tells us the right piece of information, and then the right person hears that. And that often leads to breakthroughs. And that was what happened with this case. And then we went about putting together a prosecutable case that withstood, and got us a 25-year plea agreement. Not long enough, but it is what it is. And, she did do 22 and a half years. She's actually out now in Puerto Rico getting awards for her espionage from a human rights organization in Puerto Rico, sitting next to literally a convicted terrorist.
Boy, that's a sell right there in and of itself for the book. It's over his right shoulder for those of you watching on YouTube. The Queen of Cuba, the story about Ana Montes and how she gave all this information to the Cuban government as she worked at DIA. I can't thank you enough, Pete, as always, coming on the program, former FBI special agent. Please go get his book out there. Thank you as always, Pete. Continued success to you, my friend. Stay safe, buddy.
I'm glad we can please talk.
That's right.
Love you guys. Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Love you too, buddy. Hey, thanks for watching the Can We Please Talk podcast. Whatever clip you just watched, we hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you stick around for some more. Subscribe to the channel. My partner's over here smashing the button. Come on, do him a favor. So hit subscribe.